Yeah, I've got that there. Thank you. Can you all hear me there? I can't see those, so I'll use this here. Firstly, I have to, is Pradeep still here? I have to have taken right of reply as the specialist in the room. That most of us don't think we're gods. We've also got children who tell us, and wives who tell us, frequently not gods. When I prescribe, I very seldom write out a prescription. I almost always write a letter to the GP and ask them to prescribe the drug, because they can match it up with the instructions coming from a myriad of other sources and make sure it's... I don't know about other hospitals, but Fiona Stanley, despite the bad press we're getting at the moment, and soon the Children's Hospital take over, but every single patient that comes under my care is seen by a pharmacist. Every single one, whether I want it or not. They review every single medication, they talk to the community pharmacy and marry things up to make sure they've got a list. And when they leave, they send a reconciled list electronically, either via email or HL7 to the GP and the pharmacist. So we're doing our best to try and get things going. And it's interesting, everybody always talks about hospitals communicating badly. I have given once a whole lecture on GPs communicating badly. And I think that is the whole problem. We all communicate badly. It's neither one nor the other. I frequently get referrals that are 3 pages of Medicare and other information, and one line at the bottom says, sleep study for sleep apnea. That's the only clinical information we get, and they don't tell us about the Parkinson's and the infarcts and everything else. So, and we do just as badly. So I think we all need to improve communication. So you've heard from everybody else about falls, and I'm not going to talk a lot about, well, I'm going to talk a bit about falls and a bit about medication. I'm going to change tack considerably, because we've got to recognize that all of us spend about 1/3 of our living time either asleep or in bed. And we largely ignore that. In the hospital system, I'm frequently erased. You can see 20 pages of notes in the daytime and one line overnight that says, patient appears to have slept well. They can't even say they did sleep well, they appears to have slept well. And there's the entire entry for an overnight visit. So it's something we need to do better. I like this old Scottish thing because it reminds us that falls don't only happen in the daytime. In fact, a significant number of falls occur at night and the early hours of the morning when we're waking up. And I'll talk about that shortly. And things go bump in the night for a number of reasons. And I get people referred to me because odd things happen at night. Sometimes it is just falls. Just falls is a bad term, but it is falls for a number of reasons. Other times it's because of a sleep disorder. So I'm going to go a little bit, and what I'm going to try and do in a relatively short time is give you a very, very, very brief view of normal sleep. I normally give 2 lectures on that, so very brief. A little bit about some sleep disorders that impact on falls. A little bit on sleep treatments that impact on falls, and I've been a little liberal when I talk treatments because I don't think medicine's the only treatments we use. And then I'll talk more at the end about an alternative way of treating insomnia, which I think is an important aspect and something we can all be doing. So what is normal sleep? Well, the first thing to recognize is sleep is a gradual process. It's not like turning off a light. We gradually lose consciousness and going to sleep, but there's a long period when we're neither really awake nor asleep. And the same thing happens in the morning when we're waking up. And those are difficult periods because that time when you're not quite not awake, you become less aware of your surroundings. As we get older, and I'm realizing it more and more, as we get older, that becomes a challenging time. I've discovered that even I am prone to falls when I wake up in the middle of the night to do what men over 50 do. And if there are cords and carpets and things in the way, I have actually fallen, which was quite salutary. Why do we sleep? Well, we sleep because of a combination of processes of a pressure to sleep, which you can see is like a credit card or sleep debt that you accrue during the day or during the days. The circadian influences, the influence of our biological clock, and the normal things happening around us, and then the influence of things that are alerting us. So we might have a high sleep debt, and it might be nighttime, but we've got a critically ill patient in front of us, and the alerting influences take over. And it's that balance that determines whether we're awake or whether we're asleep. The other interesting thing is that the biological clock, which sits just between our eyes and in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is not a 24-hour clock. It's about a 24.4-hour clock. Now, you could say that's poor design, or you could say it's intelligent design, because the The not being 24 hours gives us a certain amount of flexibility. But it does become important with certain disorders, and just something to think about. We use in training light in the mornings, and that's a really important, powerful stimulus. The light we get in the mornings resets our clock, so it doesn't run at 24.4 or whatever hours. It resets to a 24-hour. So that's very important in training. Most people think of sleep like this. You're awake, go into deep sleep, and you get a little bit lighter towards morning. And it's one continuum. It's not. It's far from that. Although there are some things that are captured. So this is a very stylized view of a normal young person's sleep. And you'll see that first of all, you drift off from awake to sleep. You go into a deep sleep to start with, and then you come up briefly. Very often people wake up there very briefly after about 60 to 90 minutes. Most of us have a brief awakening then, and then have a period of very short dreaming. That REM is REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is when we dream. And we have a brief bit. And then you see we have 4 or 5 cycles of sleep over the night, getting progressively lighter as the night goes on, getting progressively more dreaming as the night goes on. So REM sleep and disorders come out of REM sleep occur in the latter half of the night. And the slow wave, or the deep sleep, which regenerates our brain, occurs in the early part of the night. So you can see most of the slow wave sleep occurs in this first bit, which is when, and that is, so if you have 2 or 3 hours of sleep and then wake up, your actual pressure to sleep and the need for sleep are far reduced, so it becomes more difficult to maintain sleep. The interesting thing about REM sleep, which is important to know, we all dream, and most of us have dreamed at some point of doing something nasty, like strangling your wife or husband or whatever it is, because they've been in real pain today. But we don't do it. The reason we don't do it is when you go into the dreaming sleep, although the brain is awake and active, you're asleep, but the brain's very active, and you do it, you're thinking all this activity in your dreams, but you don't do it because there's a certain amount of paralysis that occurs to the muscles of the body, below about the neck. The diaphragm's spared, so you keep breathing, but the rest of the muscles are paralyzed. And most of us have had the time when you're woken up out of a dream and you can't move for a few seconds. That's the paralysis that persists. And that becomes important later on in some of the conditions we'll talk about. So that's probably normal sleep. Now, falls can occur because of things that happen in normal sleep. The first thing is the environment. And I think it's a tragedy that we send people to institutions that pay lip service to the environment in which patients are expected to sleep. They put rails up to stop you falling in the daytime, all sorts of things, and put you in a bedroom where you can't find your way to the toilet, you're confused when you get up, there's Zimmer frames and cords and oxygen tubes and all things to set up to fail you at night. And then we put people to bed very early. And it's a setup for disaster. But the sleep environment itself lends itself to falls in most of our lives. The other thing is I've said that when we're going to sleep, but even just important when we're waking up, it's not a light switch. We don't wake up, unlike the cornflakes adverts and things. We just don't wake up like that, most of us. And some rare people do, I hate them. But most of us, sleep gradually wears off and wakefulness gradually comes on. Now, I've got a picture that shows that later on. But there's a period of what we call sleep inertia, when you're awake, but you're not awake. And your brain's not functioning properly, and your body's not moving properly, and you're clumsy and inert and inept, and you're at a high risk of falling in that situation. That happens to most of us when we first wake up. And if you're one of these people that alarm gets up and you bounce up and you get out of bed, I pity you when you turn 60, because it's going to fail. And you get up at night to go to piddle or whatever, and you have this bit of inertia going on, and you're clumsy, and it makes life a lot more difficult and increases our risk of falls. Then REM sleep, as I've said, we have the sleep paralysis. If you wake up out of REM sleep, and we've all done that, we've woken up dreaming, you're ice cold because your core temperature's right down, and you have to get up because something's happened, answer the telephone, whatever it is, you find that you're more clumsy then, and that's because the paralysis is still wearing off. So parts of normal sleep enable all of us to have falls when everything else is actually going okay. But most of us, fortunately, our neurological systems and everything else are stable enough we can overcome that. But you just need a few little things like the wrong drug or a bit of Parkinson's or mild stroke or something to tip that balance so that even normal sleep can predispose you to falls. I'm now going to go a whirlwind tour of some important sleep disorders that may impact on falls. And I categorize sleep disorders under 3 categories. Those that make you too sleepy, those that make it difficult to get to sleep or stay asleep, and then the weird bunch called the parasomnias, but they're all the interesting but wacky things. I'll talk about each of those. There are 3 main disorders that make you very sleepy. Now, obviously, if you're very sleepy, you've already heard hypnotics and benzodiazepines and things make you sleepy and increase your risk of falls. Well, sleep disorders can do that as well. The one everybody knows is sleep apnea, where people usually overweight, airway blocks off, and the snoring gets worse, and they stop breathing frequently at night, so they don't get refreshing sleep, and they're very sleepy in the daytime. Fall asleep driving cars, doing work, all sorts of things like that. But they're very, very sleepy. And that sleepiness itself can manifest as daytime falls. And I've seen that not infrequently. And the problem with sleep apnea is that it gets worse and more prevalent as we get older. So the older population who tolerate the consequences of sleep apnea more or less well have a higher prevalence, and it's a challenge to treat. The other thing about sleep apnea that many people don't know is that repetitive awakening, you wake up as though you're being choked repeatedly overnight. Now, you may not wake up wide awake, but you're to a lighter level of sleep. That repetitive awakening has a adrenergic stimulus to it, and it makes your bladder full. And so people with sleep apnea get up frequently. Most of my patients will say, oh, I get up 5, 6, 7 times a night to piddle. Okay, put them onto treatment and it goes away like that. So I get a lot of referrals from neurologists actually, because they now are realizing that one of the causes of nocturia is sleep apnea. So those 2 things there in sleep apnea can increase risk of falls in the daytime and at night, because it puts you in an awkward situation. Was somebody asking something?
When you say treatment, you mean like so treatment for sleep apnea?
Yeah.
That stops it.
Yeah. Whatever treatment. Okay. Treatments for sleep apnea in a nutshell. Everybody thinks of CPAP, and I'll talk briefly about that later. But there are others as well, such as weight loss. Shattering. Most people don't know, but shattering. Weight loss fixes it. There are some splints you can use as well. So there are some others. Narcolepsy is a condition most people don't know a lot about. It's as prevalent as multiple sclerosis, but for some reason isn't as sexy and doesn't get the impact. It's a genetic condition, by and large, and it makes people incredibly sleepy, and they fall asleep within, I've got people who fall asleep in time, and fall asleep within 30 seconds to 2 minutes in the middle of the day. So it makes you very, very sleepy. So that obviously has an issue, but it also has this condition of cataplexy, where the paralysis of REM sleep intrudes into wakefulness. So people are wide awake and REM sleep paralysis comes in and they just lose their posture. And that is it can present as falls, often precipitated by emotional input. So you tell a really corny joke to these people and they will just lose posture, which is great if they think of it as school kids. And if they get very frightened. So one of my patients found it out because when she was being chased by bullies at school, the more up she was trying to run away and the more frightened she got, she lost posture and fell to the ground, which was quite challenging. So the cataplexy itself can cause problems. Now, narcolepsy we treat with alerting drugs like modafinil and dexamphetamines as stimulants. But cataplexy we treat with drugs that reduce REM sleep. And that tended to be, in the early days, the tricyclic antidepressants. Then we moved on to, more recently, a lot of people use fluoxetine for that, which has its own side effects, of course. And unfortunately, now a lot of people are using venlafaxine, which has its own myriad of side effects that has become very popular for treating cataplexy. So the disorders can contribute to falls, but so can the treatments. Sleep restriction isn't really a disorder, it's just really bad management. Sleep restriction is probably one of the commonest causes that most of us are too sleepy. And this happens on Mondays quite frequently, I'm sure. You know, you've had a heavy weekend, you've been party, you've gone to bed late, you've got to get up early on Monday, you haven't had enough sleep. As I said, sleep is that interplay between the amount of sleep debt we've got, the circadian and the alerting activities. And that sleep debt is just like a credit card. If you habitually undersleep, cut short your sleep, you will eventually have to pay it back. It's a fact of life. And sleep restriction makes people, because they're not sleeping enough during the weekend, they often get problems during the week. And kids particularly, you see this particularly in adolescents who have a phase shift in their sleep and have to get up early for school, and they're often doing jobs as well, and therefore are sleep deprived. And that's usually why adolescents sleep so much, not because they're going through adolescent turmoil. Then the two conditions I want to talk about initiating and maintaining sleep. Initiating, it's getting to sleep and staying asleep, are insomnia, and I won't talk a lot about it, and circadian disorders. Circadian rhythm is the fact that our biological clock is not 24 hours, and that it matures over our life. Now you all know when the kids are born, they go to bed very early, and that's blissful, so you can watch telly and do your things, and they wake up early in the morning when you want to sleep, and it's a pain in the bum. Then they become teenagers, and they do the opposite. Okay? They won't go to bed when you want to be doing things, and they want to go to bed maybe 12, 1 o'clock, and they want to sleep through till 9, 10 o'clock. And that's normal. That's normal. Okay? It is part of the maturation of the biological clock. And if we accept that, it makes life a lot less challenging. Then as we become adults, it shifts into what we call the normal time, and I don't really know anymore, having done sleep for so many years, what normal is, because each person has different, depends whether you're a share milker or a truck driver or whatever you are. People have different things. But basically what we would call a normal sort of 9, 10, 11 bedtime till 6, 7, 8, getting up in the morning. And then tragically, as we get older, we start reverting back towards the childhood one. And that phase tends to shift towards wanting to go to bed earlier and get up earlier. And that is a challenge, because, I think this microphone is gone. It's a challenge because people go to bed early, and then they find they're waking up in the middle of the night. And there's not a lot to do in the middle of the night. Even the TV is terrible when it's doing to porn. There's really nothing. And so people then present to their GPs or to us as having insomnia because they can't stay asleep all night. They expect you to sleep for 20 hours. So the circadian rhythm is really important. Insomnia, and I give a talk on insomnia, and I won't try and go through insomnia because there's a lot to do with it. But a lot of insomnia starts as a reaction to something, and then develops into a learned behavior and habitual behavior, where people become frightened to go to bed because they're not going to sleep, and they're trying very hard to sleep because they have to get to sleep, otherwise they're not going to function the next day, and they worry about how they can't function, and as they worry more, they become more and more anxious, and so sleep is just the last thing that's going to happen. Now, insomnia is much more common in the elderly, one, because of the circadian shift, and they try to sleep at different times when it's not conducive, often helped by institutions where they feed people at 4 o'clock and expect them to go to bed because the night shift is reduced. In elderly, insomnia is a problem because there's much higher use of hypnotics in the elderly population than in the younger population, and we've really heard a lot about the hypnotics, and I'm not going to keep unpacking them. But the drugs we use have a much lower therapeutic index in the elderly, so the limit between the good effects and the bad effects is very, very close. And very often to get the good effects, you're getting a lot of bad effects at the same time, and it's arguable whether you're actually doing any good overall. Pradeep has really said these people have a huge amount of comorbidities, and we all know how to manage each condition in isolation, but nobody really is putting them all together and how to do a chronic disease as a disease rather than as separate diseases management. Polypharmacy is just ubiquitous. I remember 20 years ago when we thought 3 or 4 drugs was polypharmacy. Now you have to see a cardiologist, and that's the starting point of 2 drugs, you know, it's terrible. And the drugs we use have a longer duration of action because of the metabolism in the organ. So treating insomnia is a big problem because of the huge use of hypnotics in this population. Very briefly, parasomnias, I'm going to mention because they contribute to falls. There's a condition called Restless Leg Syndrome, where people often start in the evening sitting in front of telly, you get this discomfort in your legs, and you have to move. You get into bed and your legs are jerking, you're kicking. Most of the time it's not a problem, except for your partner, and it wakes you up a little bit. It's often relates to pregnancy, to renal failure, and to iron deficiency. And in fact, all 3 of them relate to iron deficiency, because you get iron deficiency both in pregnancy and renal failure. So the treatment of that, the best treatment of that is treatment with iron to get the iron up, and that actually solves a lot of people's problems. But it can be that severe that the kicking and jerking is that severe that people fall out of bed. Okay. It doesn't affect them when they're up and about, but it reduces their sleep and makes them sleepy. We treat that sometimes with Cinemet or drugs, dopaminergic drugs, and Pramipixole, Cifrol, which is quite a good drug for that. But the drugs also have their side effects as well. So for a lot of what I do, it's balancing one or the other. REM behavior disorders are a really interesting one. It occurs predominantly, but not exclusively, in men from about 45, 50 on. Is related later on to neurodegenerative problems. But what happens is the dreams no longer are contained. So people have dreams. They're often different dreams. They're more violent, aggressive dreams, but they act them out. So they will strangle their wife, thump their partner, tackle the wardrobe, and hurt themselves. And there can be quite a lot of injury occurring at night. And it often presents to me as falls at night, because people are falling out of bed, or they're getting up and working around and falling. So they present with that. It responds usually exquisitely sensitively to a very low dose of clonazepam. 0.5 milligram to 1 milligram maximum usually fixes it. But later on, it's not enough neural problems. Then there are all the other things, sleepwalking, sleep talking, night terrors, which can present as abnormal behavior and can cause falls at night, which a lot of people use hypnotics to make people stay asleep. And to prevent these, I think behavioral medicine is a far better way of dealing with it, quite honestly. You need to look at the underlying psychological and other problems that lead to it. So, moving briefly on to treatments. There are 3 treatments we use at night that contribute to falls. Oxygen. I'm frequently asked to prescribe oxygen to patients with COPD because they're a bit hypoxic. And it's going to make their life better until they get up in the morning with a fractured leg of fever because they've tripped over the oxygen tube. It limits their mobility because they've got this tubing, and so they're less mobile, they become frailer, and it's one of these other things you've got to balance very carefully. And the problem is oxygen doesn't relieve breathlessness, which is why most people refer it. It's only there to lengthen life rather than to relieve breathlessness. So it is something to bear in mind. Oxygen at night is a major problem with falls, and I've seen it very, very frequently in my COPD population. They're osteoporotic, they're deconditioned, and then the oxygen tubing is the last thing they need, just to tip them over. CPAP, the face mask that we use with machines used for treating sleep apnea, do contribute to falls as well. So they make you better, they stop you getting up to piddle in the night, but if you do get up to piddle, you've got a machine attached to your face with a hose to a machine next to you which is plugged into electricity. So it's difficult to get out of it, and if you wake up a little bit confused, you've got a bit of sleep inertia, getting it off and getting around, people fall out of bed because they get up to go to the toilet and they fall over. The other thing is that what a lot of my patients do, instead of taking the mask off, they just unplug the hose from the tube, from the machine, and they trip over the hose in the way. So in a way it causes falls as well, which in the older population is a big problem for me. The other thing is CPAP drops your blood pressure. So a significant amount of my patients come in hypertensive, they go into CPAP, and over the next month or so their blood pressure falls. Unless their GP is watching their blood pressure and back titrating their medication, and they don't want to because the specialist told them you have got to use it, Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. They run into problems with falls, postural hypotension, particularly in the elderly. And then medications. They've already had bad press from all the other speakers, so I'm just going to go through a couple of things just to shed a slightly different light on them, perhaps. And I'm using a broad term, hypnotics, to cover the whole damn lot. That includes benzodiazepines, the Z drugs, which marketers like to have in a separate thing, but they're really not. And the psychotropics and antidepressants, they all are used as hypnotics as well as for other reasons. And in the insomnia, they're all used interchangeably by different people, often using 2 or 3 of them at the same time. A lot of the early studies show that hypnotics generally, both benzos and other psychotropics, give you an increased falls risk. Most of the early studies were done in elderly people, obviously, and institutionalized people. And there was quite strong evidence. And then when those were taken in the more community studies, it became less clear. So some of the studies said, no, there was no increased risk in people who were on these drugs, and others said there was. The larger scale studies do suggest there's increased risk of the use of both benzodiazepines and psychotropics and the risk of falls, and more importantly, the risk of injury with a fall. So it's not just increasing the falls, but also when you get a fall, you fall harder and you have high injury. So both those factors. And the consensus, certainly in the early 90s, was that was the case. Then Brassington's group in 2000 published this report, this study, where they looked at people who reported sleep problems, and they looked at their falls risk and the use of drugs. And they showed that the risk was related to the sleep problems, not to the drugs, not to the psychotropic drugs, although they thought the benzos did cause a bit of an increased risk. And then about 5 years later, a questionnaire study looked at people with insomnia, questionnaires with older people with insomnia and medications. And they showed, interestingly, the falls were strongly related to insomnia. So the presence of insomnia increased your risk of falls, with or without medication. People who used medication that didn't respond, the insomnia didn't respond, still had a higher risk of falls. But those who used hypnotics and responded, in other words, the insomnia got better, they didn't have an increased risk of falls compared to the general population. So the take-home message from that group of studies was that insomnia, sleep disturbance, causes falls. Hypnotics can cause falls, but if they actually fix the insomnia, they seem to balance out. We still don't know. There's still work going on, and I don't think the answer's out. But briefly, Sonia and Coley Israel's group, published by Stone here a few years ago now, did quite a nice study looking at, and it was a prospective study over about 8 or 9 years, so it was quite a long study. And they looked at community-dwelling older women. They'd subsequently done work in men as well. But they looked at, this was a women's look. Sonia has a legacy of work in women's health and women's sleep health, which is why it was a woman. And she used actigraphy. Somebody was walking around with a Fitbit. Who was walking? Somebody. There we are. But it's something like a Fitbit, but it's a more expensive, a smarter version that monitors your activity and works out whether you're awake and sleep. So looking at how much sleep these people had, and looked at their medications and what they were taking, and then from that looked at their risk of falls over the next 8 years. A couple of interesting things. Firstly, the use of benzodiazepines, either short or long-acting, did increase the risk. So there's the odds ratio, it's about 1.4, 1.5, but you'll see the error bars overlap 1, so it's not statistically significant. So it's a slight increase, but it's not significant. And it was quite a big study. However, if you look here, you'll see that if you look at the total sleep time, to start with, I'll show it on here, sorry. I think I've lost my mouse. Okay, look at the total sleep time. And you'll see that for people who are sleeping between 7 and 8 hours a night, if they're the reference group, if you sleep shorter than that, 5 to 7 or less than 5, your risk for falls goes up significantly. And if you sleep longer than that, it goes up. And if you look across the table, it doesn't matter how much you adjust for different things, including sleepiness and walking speed and all sorts of things, the risk remains there. So there's a U-shaped curve. If you sleep in the 7 to 8 hours a night, habitually, your risk is optimal. Sleep longer, sleep shorter, your risk goes up. It's mirrored in sleep efficiency, so if the sleep is less efficient, as you are with any sleep disorder, particularly insomnia, your risk goes up. If you take a long time to fall asleep, your risk goes up. And if you naps in the daytime, which again reflects your lack of sleep at night. So basically, her group is showing that it's the sleep or lack of sleep which seems to be the major driver for the falls, rather than the medications per se. I haven't put it on here, she's done a subsequent study in elderly men showing the same sort of thing, but also in that study showed a very small increase in that same group, increased risk of benzodiazepines, both Zeds and others, increasing risk, but not nearly as strong as the lack of sleep. So I'm going to change tack now and do a whirlwind thing on an alternate way to treat insomnia. Charles Moran in Canada does a lot of work on this, and this is from a meta-analysis he did some time back, and it just illustrates here. So on the y-axis, you've got the total sleep time. So higher is better. And you'll see that people use temazepam in the first few months have an increased sleep time. So it works for a while. And then it falls off. So by the time you get to about 24 months, it's no longer working. But they still take it, and you can't get them off. If you use CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, it takes a while to kick in, but it gets better as time goes on because people become able to manage themselves. Now, some people have done some studies to look at what about combining the two. And there's no evidence that combining the two does any better than CBT alone. You may get some quick effect, but then you've got the problem of trying to get the people off it. In very bad cases, I'll sometimes use not months, but I'll use 4 or 5 weeks of sedative hypnotic. I usually use Zopiclone myself, but it doesn't matter what. Just for a few weeks while you're starting the CBT. But by and large, I don't use them at all. And there's multiple studies. I could show you many studies which have shown this now. So what then is CBT? This is something that you refer somebody to psychologists and pay a lot of money for. And I mean a lot of money. Oh, my slides have all been changed. Those were totally different. Those were white when I last saw them. That's right. That's what happens. That's changing from Mac to Windows. So I apologize for the writing. There are 3 components to cognitive behavioral therapy. There's the behavioral component, which has both general and specific parts to it. There's the cognitive behavioral component and the educational component. It sounds really important. Let's look at the general component. Exercise. Well, that's something all of you can do. Okay? You can also tell your patients to. So exercise promotes sleep. By keeping you active in the daytime, you're physically more fatigued in the evening, you sleep better. In the elderly, they've shown even small amounts of exercise, 15-20 minutes a day, improve sleep significantly. And then you've got all the other benefits that exercise gives you. Bright light therapy. I said before, our cycle's not quite regular, particularly in the elderly. We're tending to go the wrong way, going to bed earlier. Bright light helps you by resetting your clock. So when you wake up and you expose yourself to bright light in the morning, it resets your biological clock. It's used effectively for people with seasonal affective disorder. It's a really good antidepressant for insomnia. It's very good generally in making you feel better. So encourage our people to wake up at a regular time and get out into the sunlight. Fortunately in WA we don't buy, most of the year have to go and buy lights to treat it like these expensive things here, because we've got it even more potent just outside. We get people to sit outside and look at the sun. This sort of light is not good enough. It's the wrong wavelength and it's not nearly bright enough. So you want to get outside and get some good sunlight. Those are part of the general things, as is what we call sleep hygiene. It's a terrible term, sleep hygiene, but basically maintaining a regular sleep-wake cycle, going to bed only when you're sleepy. There's no point going to bed at a fixed time, like we tell our kids to, just because it's a fixed time. Go to bed when you're sleepy. If you're not sleepy, you're not going to fall asleep. Those three things haven't come together yet, so you might as well not go to bed. You might as well use the time more profitably until you're ready to go to bed. Because if you go to bed when you're not sleepy, you won't fall asleep, and you'll just set up the bad behavior. Avoid caffeine and alcohol at night before you go to bed. I didn't show the slide the major influence alcohol has on the early impact on sleep and sleep disorders. Exercise, careful use of naps, so don't nap in the daytime, so it reduces your debt, so you don't need to sleep as well at night. The bedroom environment should be an inviting environment. We should not have a myriad of computers and telephones and televisions and all sorts of things there. The bedroom should be a nice, calm place, tastefully decorated, that's designed purely for sleeping and sex and nothing else. Because that sets your mind in the right mood for going to bed. And worry time should be kept out of the bedroom. Do it in your lounge or somewhere like that, away from the bedroom. Get your worry out before you go to bed. So if you go and start worrying in bed, you're just going to be alerting yourself and not fall asleep. When it comes to the specific behavioral components, there are two goals. One is what we call stimulus control therapy, and the other sleep restriction. They're elegant terms for very simple things. Stimulus control therapy is just moving on from what I've been saying, that we want to strengthen the relationship with going to bed and falling asleep, and take away going to bed and worrying about not sleeping. Okay. So, in people with insomnia, bedtime, bedroom, nearly finished. Bedtime, bedroom, and bed are related to sleep incompatible activities, reading, watching TV. They read to go to sleep rather than to stay awake or to read. They get frustrated, they're anxiety, they worry about not sleeping. And with stimulus control, we try to change that to go to bed, it's drowsy, you're relaxed, you're going to fall asleep, like we normally do. So what we do here is we say, don't go to bed till you're sleepy. Get into bed, don't have a clock, but if in about 10 or 15 minutes you're not asleep, get up and go into your lounge and do something until you are. Scrub the kitchen, whatever you have to do, until you're sleepy and ready to go to sleep. And you go to bed when you're sleepy again, and repeat that. And you keep doing that until you fall asleep and stay asleep. And to start with, you might take you several hours before you actually get into bed and fall asleep. And that's good. You get up at the same time in the morning, no matter what time you got to sleep. Even if you only got 1 hour sleep, you still get up at the same time. Because that's moving us on to the next stage. Bed, I've said the rest already. Don't nap, or certainly not long naps the daytime. And so that is saying that if you're worrying in that, you're getting out of bed, you're removing yourself from the stimulus, so that you're reinforcing getting into bed and falling asleep, and disassociating worry, anxiety, etc. Then we use what we call sleep restriction. So people with insomnia have reduced efficiency. They spend an awful length of time in bed for very little sleep. So most of it is lying there, staring at the ceiling, worrying about your partner snoring, counting sheep, or whatever it is these days. Oh, I didn't say the last one. The most important thing is to leave these things out of your bedroom. A lot of people read their books on these now. These got a blue light. That blue light is a potent stimulus to your biological clock. Bright light given in the morning resets your biological clock. Bright light given at night sets it the other way. So these, and I'm guilty, actually tend to stop you getting to sleep. So what we do with sleep restriction is we work out how much time they should be in bed, and we restrict the amount of time in bed, right? So I'll say to people on that previous thing, okay, you want to get up at 6 o'clock, you're only getting about 5 or 6 hours of sleep. You may not go to bed till midnight. You can only go to bed at midnight if you're feeling sleepy. Okay? You do that other than getting up, you still get up at 7. The next day you had less sleep, it's that much easier to sleep. So in the end, what we're doing with those two things was we're reducing the amount of sleep the person's getting, so they're not getting enough. And like that credit card, sleep is on our side, it always wins. If you don't get enough sleep, it's going to take over. You see these guys inside the road, tanks running past, things going on, fast asleep. They've been sleep deprived, they fall asleep. It wins every time. So if you can restrict the amount of sleep people are getting, get it nice and regular, and break that cycle, it always wins if you can get people to do it. And it's actually very simple. And a lot of people, just with simple instruction, I'll tell them in my clinic in half an hour a little bit about this. I'll write them a letter to send to their home to reinforce it. I see them in 6-8 weeks' time, and about 60% of people have got the problem licked. And what's more, they've been taught how to fish. They can keep on looking after themselves. They don't have to keep going to the pharmacist for a prescription. The cognitive component just goes about challenging the unrealistic expectations and the beliefs and causes. So people think, I have to sleep X number of hours, otherwise I'm not going to function the next day. You only need to truly function 4 or 5 hours maximum. I've already mentioned the sleep inertia, so sleepiness in the morning is normal. It's normal for us to be a bit sleepy and wake up because there's that sleep inertia. This is the fascinating bit. Indulge me on time here. This is the fascinating bit. If you look at sleep in the medieval times, which is arguably more natural sleep than we have now with electricity and iPads and iPods and all the rest of it, sleep was segmented. There was a first deep sleep where people went to bed when the candles went down, so usually about 7, 8 o'clock, and they'd sleep for about 3 hours. Okay? And they'd wake up 11, 12 o'clock. Hence matins, monks go to matins in the middle of the night because that's when most people woke up. And you'd have an hour or two socializing. People go and visit and have tea with neighbors, they'd chat to one another, do some work, have sex, do all the things that you want to do. They go back to bed for second sleep, which was a lighter, dozing type of sleep. If you think about it, that's what we do, except we squash them together because of the constraints of modern life. Okay? And so we often do wake up in the middle of the night and go back, and that last bit is a more dozing sleep. That's normal. So if people recognize and understand this, it makes it easier to actually accept where they are. And the educational component is just about health practice and environment, things I've been talking about already. And then relaxation techniques, sometimes useful. The most useful one I find is paradoxical intention. I'll tell people to get into bed and try and stay awake. It's incredibly powerful. Now, this is so easy nowadays that Charles Moran has started Shut-Eye and commonly Glasgow Sleep.io, which are internet-based things where you pay your money and you can do all this CBTI over the internet. Patients can do it. It costs about a couple of $100 for a course. And they're actually very useful and very, very good. I've actually been through them all. So the final slide is this lovely thing from Viktor Frankl many years ago. It sleeps like a dove that's landed in your hand. As long as you ignore it, it'll stay there. As soon as you try to get hold of it, it flies away. It sleeps like that. As soon as you try to sleep, you fail. A bit like humility, isn't it? Thank you.
Thanks, John. That was absolutely wonderful. And does anyone have a question for John? I might have one for you, John. One of the things in DBA mates and NPS medicine-wise, trying to look at elderly people and the fact that they don't need as much sleep. So because they go to bed early and they want to be asleep, they're cold, they're lonely, so they're going to bed at 7 and then they're saying, I'm up at 2, 3. Yeah. How do you handle that?
Well, I handle that by saying what I've already said, telling them about it. And it's a really big problem. It's less so here. When I went to New Zealand, that was a really big problem. Because the elderly people, they often were used to getting up to milk cows, and they tend to be a bit earlier to bed than 2 hours anyway. And then winter comes, and it's cold. They're poor, the pension's bad, and it's getting worse. And so they get into bed. It was cheap to keep the bed warm than the house warm. Yeah. So they're going to bed at 4, 5, 6 in the afternoon. And they don't actually need less sleep. Older people get less sleep, not that they need it. Their brain still needs that sleep, but there's more intruding on it. your arthritis, your nocturia, all the other things that are happening, the dementia also impact. So a lot of things eroding your sleep. Doesn't mean you need less. They still need the same amount of sleep, and that's what Sonia was showing in that study. Those were elderly people. Those were 70+ people. They were best optimal at 7 to 8 hours a night.
Yes.
Okay. So, and then as you say, they go into bed then, and they get waking up 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2 o'clock, and you've got depression. You go to most practitioners, say, I'm waking up every night at 2 o'clock, early morning wakening, have some Prozac. It's not going to fix it. It's looking at the whole thing. And what I do is I try and shift their bedtime up to a more normal one and address all these other things. Treat their arthritis if I can. Look at why they're incontinent or why they got bacteria. It's a looking more holistic approach rather than a quick fix. This is what it is.
Yes.
And drugs are not the answer, because no drug is going to keep you sleeping for 16, 17 hours a night. And if it does, you're going to be in big trouble. So I don't think drugs are the useful thing. I think the bright light is very useful, and using behavioural techniques to get people moving. And you can't do it quickly, but you move it a little bit.
So CBT in older people?
Very, very effective, yeah. So the CBT, the insomnia type CBT, which is often managed by psychologists, and most of us can't afford to see a psychologist. And even most of my patients, the GP will refer them, they get 2 or 3 sessions, it's not enough. Colin Espy, who was in Glasgow, has done a tremendous amount of work where he's actually worked with practice nurses initially, and taken GP practice nurses and trained them to provide CBTs. And they're often learning 1 week ahead of the group. But after a while they get, and he's shown that they can deliver CBT for insomnia just as well as a clinical psychologist for the masses. There are going to be hard ones, just like GPs and specialists. GPs can look after most of it, but there's some nitty-gritty ones that have to go to the specialist. Same thing with insomnia. So practice nurses in New Zealand, in my sleep practice there, I trained sleep scientists who are not nurses or doctors, they're scientists. They do sleep studies. I trained them to do CBT, and I'm looking to do the same thing here. But you know, and now we've got all this other stuff. But Colin's work has shown that you can do it in the very elderly. You just have to adapt what you're talking about in that little bit. He's used it very extensively in people with cancer, people undergoing chemotherapy and radiotherapy.
In aged care facilities, I know it's a real issue, and the elderly go, I'm not nuts.
Yeah, exactly, that's it. And the problem is in aged care facilities, it's a financial one, isn't it? Because you've got your staff in the daytime and you've got less staff at night. So you want everybody bathed, showered, fed, put to bed before the day staff go off, and not bother the night staff. But they're going to bother the night staff because they're awake and they want to play poker or whatever. You know, we actually need to get the facilities to actually see that and move it.
We might have to get you back for another.
I spent several sessions with a psychiatrist at Bentley talking about this.
Yeah.
I
think it's a huge area.
It's a very big, and you know, I don't think it'll take a lot of money. It's a matter of changing mindsets.
Culture, yeah.
And that's what it is. And look, to be honest, most of sleep medicine, I spend most of my time talking. I hardly ever write a prescription, apart from CPAP, because that's just really better. But the rest of it is mainly getting people to understand and modify behaviour, parasomnias, all these other things.
And not just treating the person, but also educating the carers and the healthcare professionals. So
and then there's all these interactions with other diseases and things. And
it's been wonderful. Thank you so much.